Welcome to Tech Support, a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ, where we encourage and equip people to interact with the biblical text. We are your hosts, Tim Martin and Brian LeMaster.
Welcome back, everybody. We have a new season starting up. And for this first part of the season, we are going to look at a series that we're calling Prince of Darkness. I'm excited about this. This is going to be a 5-week study where we look at Satan and 1 week as well as demons. So today we're going to be looking at Satan in the Old Testament. Then we will look at Satan in the New Testament. We'll spend a week looking at legends about Satan, then demons, and then Satan's influence on people today. So keep this in mind as we go through this, that we are going to be looking at the Old Testament today, so there will be things that we won't touch on for a couple weeks here. So just kind of keep that in mind. We're only going to focus on certain areas when we go through this. So it'll be important to listen to all the episodes in there to capture a complete kind of biblical thought of who Satan is. After that, we are going to jump into a 6-week series on spiritual disciplines. Also excited about that as well. So as we begin, I want us to think about how Satan is viewed today. And I would say, Tim, probably the most common perspectives of him is he's like the boss of evil, maybe God's greatest enemy. You think of like ruler of demons and also associated with hell. So it'll be interesting if that's what you kind of think as well, to keep that in your back of your mind and see if that matches up with what we see in the Old Testament about Satan. But as we kick it off, let's go through maybe some common names that are used for Satan. And maybe, Tim, you can walk us through a little bit of the background, things that we may cover in other weeks, and then we'll jump into the Old Testament there. So I wrote down a few here. One being Satan, which is the main one that we're going to be using. Devil, accuser, adversary, serpent, and Lucifer. Let's go backwards on that list.
Let's go
Lucifer.
Yes, Lucifer off the list
for 100. Lucifer
for 100 that was never the name of Satan. And so, that we can take that one off the list. That comes from the Latin for light bearer in Isaiah chapter 14, which is not a passage about the devil at all. The devil is not in Isaiah at all. We don't see anything in there. But in Isaiah 14, 12 through 15, this is reflected from the Latin Vulgate into, I think really the only English translation that has this is the King James Bible or the New King James Bible, and perhaps early derivatives of that.
Yes, I was going to say there are some ones out there, but they all are built on that King James.
ASV or Revised Standard Version or something. And so somehow, and I looked back, and thinking about where did that come from? And Lucifer is a word; it's a Latin word, and so then all of a sudden became a proper, instead of being a descriptive term about someone's task. And this passage that we have here in Isaiah is not about Satan; it's about a king. I can't remember if it's Tyre or Sidon or some king that's being decried against. But somehow this has become a passage that people think is talking about Satan. Now, it's certainly related to some things we're going to talk about the modern Western Christian thoughts of Satan was a beautiful angel named Lucifer, and he rebelled against God, and he was cast out of heaven, and a lot of origins in Genesis chapter 6, and some of Peter's writings, and even perhaps some Jewish pseudepigraphal writings in the time between the Testaments. And so we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later, but that passage, that word is not a proper name. It's a description of someone. That's why most of your current translations translated as light bearer. I think I'm trying to think of what all.
A lot of them say, day star, maybe
day-star,
son of dawn,
morning star, star of the
English,
morning, shining one. Astronomically, that's common reference to Venus in that way. And so, and in the Septuagint, it's not a proper name. And so we're talking about a text that predates our Hebrew Bible that's used for our Old Testament by over 1,000 years. It uses morning star is how it's translated most time into English, but it is not a proper name either, somewhat. And so it was never a proper name. And so somehow that kind of got mixed in with that, and it's Lucifer. You got all kinds of stuff in pop culture about that, but we can take Lucifer off the list because it's simply not a proper name of anyone in the Bible. And I don't know enough about when that morphed into something, but certainly has its origins in the Latin Vulgate because it is a Latin word.
Yeah. And even I looked up the New King James to see what they did with it, and they added a footnote in there that says LIT, literally day star. So they went ahead and added that footnote. So all your modern English ones.
Good for them.
Yeah. All right, let's skip and tell us about this word Satan.
what we have in English with a capital S is a Hebrew word, Satan, which means some of the other words you said, adversary or accuser. Primarily, I think it's accuser. That's what it means in Hebrew. And so we're going to talk today about when we see in English Bibles, we need to make sure and concentrate on English Bibles when they use the proper name Satan, when translators have chosen to render that Hebrew word as a capital S proper name Satan, then they've taken a Hebrew word and a meaning and converted it into a proper noun. And so that word simply, like I said, means accuser. I kind of compare it to what like a district attorney or somebody ought to be. Somebody brings charges against somebody in a judicial setting. And that's really the setting that we see spoken about in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And we'll talk a little bit about when it might be a proper name, but for most of the time, it is not a proper name. And so we'll talk through some of that. But it means the accuser, or it can mean an adversary. And that's where we get the word Satan. We take a Hebrew word, we make it a proper name, and we call it Satan.
Yeah, and I think that is important for people to recognize the difference there, that this Hebrew word is not just a name for who we think of, Satan, the devil, and stuff like that. That same word is used for humans as well.
And for an angel. Yeah. The angel that blocks Balaam's way on the road is his adversary. And so, yes, it's translated in English Bibles many times, and we'll look at some of those things where it is just referring to some human being that's an opponent of David or somebody like that. So it can be translated that, but I think there's some reasons it's translated at a proper noun. In some cases, I think it has to do with the fact that our English Bibles are translated by Christian interpreters, and so they read some things into their interpretation of that. I think it's an interpretation in the Old Testament, not a correct one. But we'll talk about that a little bit.
All right. Do we want to jump into some examples here?
Are you talking about like of that Hebrew word in the Old Testament? Yeah, we certainly can do that. Now, do we want to talk about, kind of thinking about some of the times where it's used to just mean some kind of earthly Satan, or do we want to just I'll talk about them very
Let's give, I think, at least one example of that.
A few of those, like in 1 Samuel 29:4, for example, that Hebrew word appears where the Philistines are speaking of David as their adversary. In 2 Samuel 19:22, the sons of Zeruiah versus David. 1 Kings 5:4 said there were no enemies for Solomon. There are no adversaries in that way. Also, we even see in Psalm 109:6, the accuser is one of the psalmist's enemy. And it's translated, interestingly enough, in the Douay Rheims, which is an English translation of Latin Vulgate, as of the devil. And then it's Satan in the King James Version, but it's accuser in the New King James Version. And so it's translated different ways in English Old Testaments as enemy or accuser or adversary, but it's clearly talking about a human being, some sort of human adversary, some sort of human opponent in the Old Testament.
All right, what about, can we flip over to maybe Numbers 22:22?
We can, and verse 32.
That's what first on my list, yeah.
Yeah, that's where we have this situation with Balaam and the donkey crossing the bridge, and the angel is this messenger of God, opposes his way, and only the donkey can see. Didn't we do a show about Balaam?
We did, yeah.
I thought we did. Okay, I've got to go back.
I'm glad you remember what we've covered.
That's right. I think it all runs together.
Yes.
But yet this angel is like Balaam's adversary in sort of an opponent way that we see that. But that's the same Hebrew word, Satan. Obviously, English translators knew it was not talking about, we'll call it the prince of darkness or the devil. It was one of God's messengers sent to oppose Balaam. And so, but he plays a role. Essentially, we're talking about something that's a role somebody plays there.
Yep. All right. What about, here's one that I think people, if they're familiar with the Bible, will definitely be familiar with this one. What do we make of Job chapter 1 and Job chapter 2 as well?
That's right.
Maybe Job 1, 6 through 12, if you're wanting to take notes or go back and read it, and then Job 2, 1 through 6 are going to be kind of your main chunks of scripture here.
Yeah, I think before we talk about that, we need to take a little bit about some Hebrew grammar. And I'm not an expert in Hebrew grammar, but in Hebrew grammar, nouns can be articular or anathrous. And I don't ever even pronounce anathrous correct, but it either can have the definite article or not. You can have a the in front of it, like the accuser, or the ha-satan. The definite article in Hebrew sounds like ha, not like you're laughing, but it's not like you're laughing now. But ha-satan would mean the accuser is how you would translate that. When it doesn't have the definite article, is when it is typically talking about an individual. Usually a person's name is not preceded by like the Moses or the Samson or something like that. You would just have, just like we do in English, we wouldn't have that. And now in Greek, it's a little bit different. Most nouns have an article with them. But in Hebrew, and this is my understanding of it, is you don't have, when it does not have the definite article, it's when it's usually talking about an individual, a proper name, or a title that you might have. But when it's talking about the idol worshipers, it would have that in front of it. And so in Job, we see in all English translations, I think, just about render the supernatural being. We definitely know it's a supernatural being. Now, I guess also we ought to address the fact that, are we going to assume Job's actual history, or are we talking about Job as like a poetry parable type thing? What's going to be your choice?
We'll go with it being actual history. There are some scholars out there, though, that would...
not just some.
Yeah. But, yeah.
Okay. And it doesn't change. What we have a situation where some supernatural divine...
You going opposite of me?
I'm going to go with you.
Oh, okay.
You're in charge. I trust your judgment. So Job actually happened. And so if it did, then this actually happened. Some supernatural divine being shows up in the presence of God, and God says, "Hey, look at Job. He's a great guy. He doesn't disobey anything." And the accuser says, "Well, of course he is. He's got it made. I mean, look at all the blessings you've given. You take all that away from him, you see if he still follows you." And then, of course, we know that was happened, and he comes back and so, "Hey, look, God's like, yeah, Job didn't deny me." And he said, "That's because you hadn't hurt his physical body yet." And so then he's able to go back. And so God allows the accuser to go and inflict pain and suffering on Job, including the loss of his children, the loss of his property, his servants are killed, all kinds of financial disaster goes on. And so we have this individual, and I think just about every English translation translates it as a proper noun, Satan, capital S, Satan. However,
yeah, let me read one of those verses so that people. So in Job 1, verse 6, this is ESV. "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them." So that's one there. And then chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord." So that's kind of your context in both of these interactions with, in the English text, Satan or accuser. Yeah.
He's obviously not someone that's included with the group, the sons of God. And so, I'm not going to say, well, if you're not a son of God, you've got to be Satan. Perhaps that's the case. And there's no question that, we want to make sure we're talking about like Satan in the Old Testament and whether or not he's prolific or very, very often mentioned, or whether the concept that what I would say is I want to say because I don't have this particular concept, but the particular Christian concept of an autonomous, evil, divine being that has his domain and is the ruler of hell and the origin of all evil and the captain of demons and the prince of the air and all the ways he's described in the New Testament. And, of course, we have him with horns and pitchfork and a forked tail and all that kind of stuff. He's always red in color. Or the dragon that we see in John's apocalyptic visions and Revelation. What I would say is that concept, and of him going around and tempting all human beings, like we sometimes put off our willingness to sin and blame it on Satan, that concept doesn't exist in the Old Testament. And so, but what we do know is that I believe Satan as a being existed at the time of the Old Testament. So I don't ever say that. I just don't think we have very much revealed about Satan in the Old Testament. And we'll expand on that a little bit here as well.
And I think that's important for people to recognize there's a difference there. And what is known to the people at the time and the writers even about Satan isn't necessarily what is true about Satan. It is true, but it doesn't mean that there's not more to him at this time, that he's still not tempting people and stuff. Even though he's not getting blamed for it, doesn't mean he's not working and stuff like that at the time.
He's extremely, even reference like Job is really it. And this and a vision in Zechariah 3. We know it's not a historical story in Zechariah 3. It is a vision. It's being seen by Zechariah, where we see another individual that most English translations say Satan as a proper noun. Satan is nearly absent in the Old Testament. And the serpent in the garden is never referred to as the accuser or the devil or anything like that in the Old Testament. We have to go all the way to somewhat of an ambiguous statement in Revelation that we'll talk about in the New Testament before that serpent of old is even equated to Satan directly in doing that. And so it's one of the reasons that we see in Judaism today, there's a lot of views about what is Satan. Is Satan just a name for the evil impulse that's in human beings? I think in Jewish mysticism, I think Kabbalah is what it's typically taught. Satan does seem to be some sort of mystical being that gets involved in people's lives. But our concept of Satan that I just talked about a minute ago doesn't really exist in Judaism. And I know that Christians believe they're better interpreters of the Old Testament than people who've been doing it for 3,500 years. But that tells me that it's not cut and dry who Satan is in the Old Testament, or Jews would have the same view that we do. And so we have the lens of the New Testament to turn back where Satan is much more prolifically mentioned, and we get a little bit more detail. Now, as we'll talk about in Legends about Satan, that's been expanded and built upon and a bunch of baloney assigned to it in what I call pop culture. But when we look at this in Job,
it's a difficult passage
it's
as well.
It's a difficult, but here's the issue is if we're going to accept what I call John Milton's Paradise Lost vision of Satan, and that Satan was an angel that rebelled against God or whatnot, was cast out of heaven, Azazel, I think is how one Enoch would refer to it, then most Christians, I think that happened in what I call a primordial time, before humans came along. Some people take Revelation 12 and believe that it's some primordial war between Satan and Michael. I don't think that at all. But I reserve the right to be wrong about that, but it's not, contextually, it doesn't make any sense. If we think about this, Satan fell long before God created the universe, or shortly thereafter, if we take a Genesis 6 approach, where the sons of God and the daughters of men type thing, if that's when he got cast down, then he's already been cast out of heaven. If we're going to take the fact that Job is an actual historical story, he's already been cast out of heaven by the time Job comes along, right? I mean, we generally would assume that. Well, if somebody rebelled against God and tried to take his power or tried to equate himself with God, all the different legends that surround Satan, how is he able just to freely go in and out of heaven whenever he wants to? Or as maybe we think about it from a perspective of the Old Testament, is it simply a divine being that doesn't mind to challenge God about his people? And are we seeing the same thing in Zechariah 3 that we'll talk about a minute ago in the first couple of verses of that? Someone standing beside Joshua and accusing him as an adversary. Is this just simply a divine being that doesn't have a name, who is an accuser of people and has come before God? Hey, look at this guy. He's got it made. And then it creates a lot of ethical issues that God allows Satan to go kill people's children and kill his servants and put disease upon him. That bothers me no matter who this individual is, that God allows that to happen to a perfectly good man. But so it creates some issues here, especially because it's articular. It says the Satan, ha-Satan. It's not a proper noun, conventionally. So the question is, why do translators translate it as such? I think it's because of the Christian tradition behind their interpretation. What do you think?
I mean, this passage is difficult to me because, like, at the beginning of the story, there's not necessarily anything evil in the question itself. Like, it could be. Normally, I would read it as like, oh, this is Satan who's like trying to trick God. But it also could be a question of somebody being like, well, duh, he's like, like that. Maybe it's not Satan. Maybe it is somebody that is not cast out of heaven that's like questioning and stuff like that.
It's just another divine being.
Yeah, another divine being.
There is a clear understanding in the Old Testament of a divine council, divine beings, beyond just God. He's not the only divine being in heaven, and really even beyond angels. There's a divine council that's seen pretty prolifically, I think, even in the Psalms and other places. And so, yeah, it's perfectly capable that person's not evil incarnate just because he's asking God a question.
Yeah, so from an Old Testament perspective.
Old Testament. Like, New Testament doesn't exist in our minds right now.
If we're just looking at it from an Old Testament perspective, like, I don't think that audience would come to the same conclusions that I do when I read back on this. That this is Satan, how we see this like prime enemy against God. Like, just reading through this, like, you don't see like this big battle going on here of like God's biggest enemy is this person right here coming before him. Because God's still giving him like a little bit of leash. So just the Old Testament perspective, I think, is much different than how we traditionally look at this passage. And if we let's just pretend for a minute that we
Job is parabolic, or it's a theological lesson, and very well it makes sense that it is. I think it's a theological lesson if it's historically true or if it's not historically true. Then it makes perfectly good sense for this person to be there as part of this thing about a man being tested before Job, and nobody has that vision. But there's nobody in the Israelite religion and writings that necessarily would have seen this in the same way that we see Satan as portrayed in modern Christianity. And so, not to say he didn't exist, maybe not even to say this is him. This could be him. Maybe he got a hall pass that day to be able to come in and out of heaven whenever he wants to. He got some ability to do that. I don't know why God would let him do that. To me, the ethical issues with what God allows whoever this being to do to Job bother me to no end. That it's a sense of great unfairness what happens to Job. And it's one thing to be sick. It's one thing to lose your money. It's another thing that God essentially condones someone's children being killed. So I got way more ethical issues with and struggles with this text than I do vocabulary or grammatical issues with it. But yeah, it could be that this is, but you would not understand that if all you had was the Old Testament. No Second Temple literature, no anything in that.
And I'm not saying it's wrong to put your stake here and say, no, this for sure is Satan. I'm just saying, I don't think that's how the Old Testament audience would have understood it completely. No, but I could be wrong.
Grammatically, if everybody was writing Hebrew the same, why would you put the article with it? Yeah. Why does it have the Satan if it's a proper name, like it'd be saying the Moses or the Adam or the Eve or something like that?
All right, let's look at some other passages you referenced. Zechariah 3, 1-2 is another one that you referenced. You want to add any more to that?
Yeah, I'm always hesitant. Same thing in Revelation. Like for example, I don't believe heaven's got a street of gold in it, okay? That was apocalyptic imagery that has contained a lot of symbolism, a lot of hidden meaning, a lot of which we don't understand. This is in Zechariah somewhat of a vision, or it is a vision similar to that. So I'm really hesitant to take it. I don't take it literally. There's no question it's not literal, but this idea of the accuser standing next to Joshua the high priest. We're not talking about Joshua, the guy that led people out into Canaan. Joshua the high priest. From this symbolic, it's a judicial setting, so it makes very good sense that this is a symbolic, like I said, a district attorney. There's an indictment being handed down, an accusation of Joshua the high priest, and it is also, I believe, articular. It is Hasatan. So the accuser is standing there, and so I think this is very symbolic. But now English translations, I think, without fail, render it as Satan. Proper noun. There's probably a whole lot of people in Hebrew who would be able to answer that question better than I can. I got 1 year Hebrew, okay, so I don't know it all that expertly, but that's also what I read that scholars say, people that do know the language. It's significant that it has the article there.
Yeah, and to me, it's also an odd passage in that if I was going back from how I understand Satan from a New Testament perspective and going back to this. And maybe I'm not fully understanding this word, but to rebuke him doesn't seem like that would be the result of what's occurring here. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Like from what we understand and all the danger and stuff from the New Testament and all we see there, this just doesn't seem to be as strong.
Yeah, right,
so. But anyways,
and this is kind of the same way we think about Jesus' rebuke of Peter. He says, "Get behind me, slanderer."
Mm-hmm.
We without fail render that against diabolos is Satan. And we think, man, that's pretty harsh words, calling somebody the prince of darkness. Is he really saying that, or is he saying, "Get behind me, you slanderer"? You're saying, I'm not going to say blasphemer because that's not the same word, but you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. You're saying something ridiculous. You're saying something negative. I am going to go be crucified and I am going to die. And so that rebuketh him. And like I said, we'll talk. Yeah, it's very strange that this would be the prince of darkness, if you will, when we think about looking at this. And so Zechariah, like I said, I'm very hesitant to take symbolic visions and all of a sudden determine something from them. We do have one more passage.
Yeah, it's an easy one for you.
Not an easy one because it's Arnothris.
All right, First Chronicles 21.
Verse 1 is what
First 1, yeah. I left first 1 off. First 1 and 2.
That's okay. I filled it in for you. Yeah, that's thanks. How we work as a team. This is obviously the chronicler. I call him the writer who thinks David can do no wrong. We believe the chronicles are written post-exilic, maybe even probably post the return from Babylon. And so they are kind of a remake of 2 Samuel and the book of the Kings. 1 Chronicles concentrates a lot on David. And it really is portrayed that David can't do any wrong. And I think maybe this is because the ideas about a Davidic kingdom and things begin to form maybe around that time. I've never researched that, but I kind of think that. Like, there's no adultery with Bathsheba in 1 Chronicles. David doesn't do anything wrong. It's not nearly the mess that we see of that. But this is a part of David's story that is told. It's really a retelling of something happened in 2 Samuel 24, where 2 Samuel 24 says, Yahweh incited David to take a census of the people. And then he gets mad at him for it, which creates a whole lot of issues in Old Testament, studies. But in 1 Chronicles 21, it is accuser, a slanderer. There's no definite article. It's not Hasatan. It is, this is where I would say it could be a proper noun. It could be Satan incited David to make a census of Israel. Now, I don't say most scholars. Many scholars believe that this is cleaning up the mess in 2 Samuel 24. That the writer of the Chronicles is like, there's no way that Yahweh incited David to make a census of the people and then punishes him for it. It makes more sense that this bad person, this bad being, incited David to make a census of the people, and the Lord rebukes him for it because of the source, and it displeases God. And so the significant is there is not the definite article. So this very well could be a proper noun. It very well could be, I believe, Satan, and even Satan's relationship with the serpent in the garden, for example. We'll read a passage from Wisdom of Solomon here in a minute about that. I do think that begins to come to light, develop, whatever you want to say, in the time between the testaments. And so whenever the chronicler wrote, and whatever editorial things that happened to Chronicles before we get it stabilized, and when I say editorial processes, I don't think there's any reason that, I don't think at all, there's no doubt that a lot of the Old Testament experienced some redaction and editing, but I think God can be behind that just like he can be behind the inspiration of the original text, is that this may have come in later on when more is known and conversations about Satan, the devil, become more prevalent like they are in the New Testament. There's no doubt in the New Testament, as we'll see, that he's looked at as this evil individual that's behind all things, and he's the ruler of this world, and doing it. So I think 1 Chronicles 21, especially when you think about maybe the dating of its writing, I'm willing to say this might be a reference to the devil or some evil being that's opposed to God, whether or not it's a complete understanding like we do of Satan. Here is where I think that makes it, and grammatically, I think it's allowed maybe for it, and it makes sense. Yahweh was, I'm hesitant to call God an individual, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
An individual, a divine being that sent, incited David to do something in 2 Samuel 24. It makes sense that this is talking about some entity, that this is an accuser. Could it be the same one that's in Job? Maybe. But it's obviously someone who has a negative influence on that. And so I don't know enough about trying to reconcile 1 Chronicles 21 and 2 Samuel 24. Our audience is welcome to go research that. But I think the chronicler probably tries to clean it up a little bit. Now, I'm sure there's some explanation out there somebody's made up about what that is.
Now, we've been saying a lot about there's a lot we don't know, and a lot of these passages could be referring to him, but it's not as like black and white as sometimes as we think, based on the text and the language and even what people knew at the time. And there may be some in our audience thinking, Tim and Brian, what about the most obvious one at the very beginning in Genesis chapter 3? Why do we think the serpent was Satan today? And I know this may jump on a little bit of what we'll cover, but we'll just throw that out there. And then
I think it's legitimate. I think we can think about, primarily, we probably believe this based upon Revelation 12 and Revelation 20, where we have the great dragon in this, where the dragon is clearly Satan. That's one of the gimmies we have in Revelation. Dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan. Now, that would be in Greek, diabolos, and then the Hebrew word Satan just brought straight into Greek, essentially transliterated Satan in Greek, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. That's in Revelation 12. And so a lot of people look at that. I look at it as a symbolic defeat of Satan by the gospel, but some people look at Revelation 12 talking about some primordial war between good and evil in heaven, and this is Genesis 6 type stuff, and we certainly have other writings in the New Testament that we'll talk about being cast out of heaven, but that's what this is, and his army of angels are cast out with him. That's fine. But also in Revelation 20, he laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. We see that as so-called millennium in different Revelation interpretations. So I think it's here that we actually see if that's a reference, if serpent of old is referring back to the serpent in Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, which I think that's perfectly
seems like the best option.
It's the best, especially with the pervasive Old Testament imagery that we have in the book of Revelation, that it makes the most sense. But this is the first place in all of Scripture, and here we are at the end of Scripture, that serpent and devil and Satan have ever been equated. That we have. Now, we have over in 2 Corinthians 11, where we have a passage that kind of talks about Eve. It's certainly talking about Eve. I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. That's just a reference back to the Genesis 3 events. There's nothing there that says the serpent, parentheses, Satan, deceived. Paul doesn't equate it. We have to wait all the way to Revelation 12, Revelation 20 to see a direct correlation between that serpent of old and that. Now, that's in canonical literature. We do have extra canonical literature in Wisdom of Solomon. If you want me to talk about that, I will, where we do see the adversary referring back to the one who originally deceived Adam and Eve. We see that in Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2, where it is because he was envious of Adam and Eve, he deceived them. And so, but it doesn't directly say the serpent who was Satan or the dragon. So maybe that was commonly known, but the only way we can know it, if I don't have the book of Revelation, then I don't believe that Satan was a serpent in the garden.
Yeah, we can assume, but where it's directly revealed there. Yeah.
I don't know how we would know that.
Yeah. Unless we just kind of lump.
Then we might say it's an agent. Yeah, we might say it's a demonic figure. It's an agent of Satan. It's an evil being working. It's an angel from Satan. So maybe we come up with that.
Yeah. What I find fascinating about the garden is, to us in the New Testament, plays a huge role in different things. And when we think back to our understanding of Satan and stuff like that, but it's not developed at all in the Old Testament. Like the garden itself is alluded to a couple times in like Ezekiel and Isaiah, but not really with an emphasis on like the serpent and temptation. You know, like it's more renewal or symbolic of different things. Like there's a couple of allusions to like Adam like breaking a covenant and stuff like that, but there's no Old Testament references back to the serpent who speaks in Genesis 3, which is very interesting. You know, like where we think today, like, oh, you got God and you got Satan and they're fighting over people's souls and stuff like that. Like that idea is not there in the Old Testament that I see. When you think about Israel and sin and their covenant with God, like obviously sin is a part of that, but Satan isn't the dominant
He's not getting blamed
figure there and stuff. Yeah. We'll so it's about them and their faithfulness to God and stuff like that. And we'll go down that path. But it's just important, I think, for us to recognize, like, when you just look at Satan in the Old Testament, like, I wrote down some things. There's a lot of things missing. Like, there's no story of Satan's fall from heaven. There's no association.
We say direct story. Someone might
Sorry. You don't have, like, him being the ruler of hell. You don't have this, like...
You don't have a hell.
Yeah, boss here versus the good. Yeah. So there's a lot of things that get developed and that we see later on that just is not yet revealed in the Old Testament, which is very interesting. Like,
which is plenty of those things.
Yes, yeah. This is not the only topic.
We'll talk about this more when we talk about Satan's influence today. I think we blame Satan for a lot of things that are our own fault. But Israel never does God say, well, Israel, you're punished here because Satan led you astray. You know, you whored after these idols. You did this. You disappointed me. It's their fault. And never do they get to pass the buck to somebody else, which I think is a very good example for us. But as you mentioned this earlier, when we think about God and Satan in this battle and this, cosmic war between good and evil and this tug of war, and that manifests itself sometimes in our world with people who follow Satan, the people who follow God. And I don't mean just people who are lost. I mean people who act as agents of the devil. I mean, I still believe in that today. I'm still, we'll talk about more about demons in the lesson, but there are people who are evil or have allowed themselves to be consumed by evil. And so sometimes we feel like Satan's evil. It's always amazing to me when people praise God for his beauty and his creation and his majesty when the sun's shining and the leaves are changing colors, but they don't praise the very same creation when it floods and kills a bunch of children in the Texas Hill Country. It's the same creation. It's the same God who put all that in motion. We can't say he causes the sun to shine and say he doesn't cause rain. So when we have this cosmic struggle between good and evil, and sometimes we think when bad things happen, it's evil prevailing in this world. That's an apocalyptic worldview that develops in the time between the Testaments and is hugely prevalent in the New Testament writings. And so I think as that became more thought about and some enlightenment with that, I know we talk about God being silent during the intertestamental period, but I don't know that God never gave anybody any knowledge during that intertestamental period. Maybe they didn't write it down, but a lot of things seem to come on the scene. For example, John's baptism. Mm-hmm. There is no explanation of where that baptism came from. Baptism for repentance of sins and for repentance and forgiveness of sins. We don't know where that came from. So maybe this hope, as more and more about Satan was revealed and evil and what's going on behind the scenes, perhaps, and maybe reflected in some Jewish literature of the period, maybe that's when people began to understand more about this devil that we see. It's mentioned often. He's much more prolific. I still wouldn't say it's prolific, but he's a known,
in comparison to
he
the
is
Old
an
Testament.
evil being. Yeah, in the New Testament, he is an evil being.
Yes,
the ruler of this world. But he's also somebody you hand Hymenaeus and Alexander over to, and so it's obviously he is seen as a being and a domain ruler. He's a certain domain. So maybe that began to be come to light supernaturally or whatever. But that struggle, that war between good and evil becomes very, very prominent. And it's in our minds. It's in our minds as well.
Any other closing thoughts as we wrap up here today?
No, I certainly, like we said, we kind of finished up with our thoughts. There's no question, I think Satan has existed since whenever God created him. Now, I'm not a theologian, so I don't know how you answer the question is, well, if God created him and God knows everything and God knows he was going to be this evil being who's going to lead so many people astray, why did he create him? I can't answer that question. That's too, you have to save that for one day when you're sitting on a couch of heaven and asking all these questions we got. I don't know why that is, but we cannot assume or project back our understanding of Satan, and even some of those understandings are from pop culture, onto the Israelite religion and the understanding of that day, nor can we say with definitiveness, is that the right way to say it?
The latter sounds more
The latter
right.
sounded better? Okay. With surety, that absolute certainty that the individual in Job is the same as what we call the devil. Grammatically, we can't do it, and so perhaps it is. I don't know how they would have even pictured that. I don't know how the ancients would have pictured that and thought about that, because even in Genesis 6, we don't have a leader of a group of angels or a leader of the sons of God who come down and have intercourse with the daughters of men. There's not an individual leader. Now, we might see that later on in, like I said, the book of 1 Enoch. So I can't even have it there. And so, anyway, I think more about him got revealed. But do I think that he existed for as far back as we can even imagine? Yes, I do think he existed. I just don't know that he was fully revealed. And his characteristics and his attributes, and that was fully revealed in the Old Testament text.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that is when you read it in English, that is an interpretation decision being made, like whether to capitalize that S or keep it as the adversary and stuff like that. So it's just not as black as white as sometimes you read it in the English text and just think, oh, well, that's the same person here and there, so.
And we don't want to discourage our listeners. Look, I say this often. I said this in a meeting last night. If you are only an English Bible reading person, you don't have the Bible. You have a derivative of the Bible, right? If you were reading it, and even if you were reading it in Hebrew, you're really reading a manuscript of the Bible that is only about 1,000 years old. So, or if we're reading Greek, we're reading something that's we're not reading the original manuscripts. I don't want our readers to think, well, if I can't read the Bible in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, then I can't understand the Bible. That's not true. Mm-hmm. What we want them to understand is that I think all of the English translations that we use as Protestants are all made by people with a Christian background. And there is always going to be interpretation and tradition carried into that. We just need to be cognizant of that.
Yep.
And if we're going to start going after some deep theological study, like, I don't know if this is even deep, but if you want to go around and say, hey, should we take care of widows and poor people? Well, yes. I mean, that's pretty obvious in the text. But when we get into something, we recognize that we need to go to people or also educate ourselves in the original language and the original context and things. We just cannot take our English Bibles and say, I think it's irresponsible to develop doctrine and theology from an English text in many cases. But it doesn't mean you can't figure it out. It just means you need to be cognizant of that and say, okay, I may have to go a step further here in my study.
Yeah. And to recognize that it's okay that not everything's revealed to us today. Like, we can still have faith. We can still have obedience to God and still not be able to understand all the ins and outs of good and evil and in the spiritual realm.
The secret things of the Lord are the Lord's. I mean, we have that all the way back in Deuteronomy. And so even in the Old Testament times, it's clear that there are things about God and the unseen world and that nobody's got.
Yeah. Hey, if you have questions or suggestions for future topics, let us know by emailing us at podcast@mountjuliet.org. To our fellow students of Scripture, thank you for joining us for tech support. We hope you will join us next week.
This is a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ. You can find more personal growth resources like this one at mountjuliet.org/resources. The Mount Juliet Church of Christ exists to glorify God and make disciples by helping people grow in Christ, love one another, and serve others.